So to get started, I think we'd like to invite you to sort of in a general way tell us how you feel your presence on the board would have made a difference had you been on the board these last 2 years, and how it will make a difference going forward.
Okay, so a couple of things come to mind. So my professional background is a little different than the makeup that's on the board now. So you've probably heard me say in debates and such that I'm a finance person by training, and I have done a lot of organizational design work and run big teams, global teams, things like that. So there's a lot that sort of comes with that I think will be useful going forward and would have been useful looking backwards. I think part of our issues around getting decisions made and helping the district staff move ahead are because our board decisions aren't clear and aren't coming quickly enough sometimes, right? So there is a way by which you can explore a topic maybe to death and then not really get to a decision. So when you're doing the public's business at 1 o'clock in the morning and the public's asleep, you're not really doing the public's business, right? Or if you have an agenda item that's 10 minutes long, when in fact the discussion is really merits 45 minutes or an hour or something else, you're really just not using that really precious time wisely, right? You only get to meet once every other week. It's for a few hours. You really need to be wise about what goes on the agenda, how much time there is on the agenda, and how those discussions move forward, like perhaps more motions so that people can have, like, on paper what they're voting on. And sometimes it's a friendly amendment to the motion and then you move on. But one way or the other, like, get something down so that there's clear marching orders for the people who have to march, because it's pretty frustrating to walk out and think, did they just tell me to do something or did they not tell me to do something? And, like, what's that about? So my experience having run board meetings and larger meetings and working in that context, I think will be helpful going forward and would have been helpful in the last couple of years. The other one is I worked in an environment, in my corporate environment, that was very transparent internally. Like, we didn't go out and tell people what it cost to make a microprocessor. That's not the kind of stuff you would share externally. But internally, we definitely had sort of a common understanding of what you wanted people to know. So we did these weekly reports, and you put in there things people were interested to know, like, oh, we got X number of things done, or we had this sort of a thing happen. And even if those things were sort of ugly, the fact that you were coming every week or every other week with this is exactly what's going on really took the stigma out of, like, if something didn't go well, because it wasn't such a red flag moment. It was just like, okay, we learned from this thing, we need to keep going. So I use that example because I think some of the stuff that has happened to the district is a little, shot themselves in the foot from having a more defensive stance on OCR sorts of things, where if you said up front, oh my gosh, I cannot believe that this has happened, this is a mistake, let's just figure out who needs to be in this conversation and go fix it, that you wouldn't really go down that sort of a vicious cycle path where, okay, we haven't said anything about this yet, so what do we say next, and, like, what happens next? And so there's a way by which it just becomes common practice to admit your mistakes and take on whatever it needs to be. Like, working with internal auditors is just like that, right? The internal auditors don't come because they think you're evil. Internal auditors come because they say, I want to check out your process, make sure it's working right, and if it's not working out, we're gonna fix that together, and we're gonna have this iterative process, and you're gonna tell me, and I'm gonna tell you, and we will get to a better outcome. So there's lots from my corporate life, I think, that helps, and then there's stuff from just having run boards here locally that I think kind of helps move. I have pretty clear, people who've been in meetings with me generally will say they know what they're supposed to do when they leave, they understand what the goals are and, like, what they should be performing to, and they feel a sense of alignment to those goals so that they know how they fit and what happens and that things are moving along.
I assume that the productivity and efficiency and effectiveness of a meeting in your mind is a shared responsibility between the superintendent and the board chair. Is that who bears the responsibility to make the improvements you're talking about?
I think that's right. And I think because the president or the board chair has so much influence on what ends up on the agenda, a lot happens with what ends up on the agenda, right? They only meet every other week. So it's really critical what gets there and how much time it has.
So there's a lot of time spent at most board meetings at the beginning with a lot of good news kinds of things. And that seems to be very important, at least to some board members, to hear stories of achievements and the good things that happen throughout the district. Are you suggesting that meetings really shouldn't include that sort of discussion because it really doesn't go towards the root policy and governance?
I would say that there are ways to recognize the great things that happen. I mean, like our students do some just amazing things, like the one going to the Godfrey Ballet and the one who wrote the book, and like just stuff that you think, like, am I a slacker? Like, why have I not done these things? And I think celebrating those at the beginning of a board meeting does give you the chance to reset on why you're there, right? Because we're there for the students. And so there is some amount of time where you want to do that. But we also have other channels for that. Board meetings only happen every other week, and so we shouldn't only be congratulating our kids every other week. So I think there's some combination of ways that you do that, but you want to recognize it. And I think a little bit of time devoted to remembering that we're there because we have 12,500 students is important. Now, there is other sort of congratulatory conversation that happens that I think maybe we don't need quite as much of. Like, I think it's appropriate to thank a staff for doing the work that they've done, because particularly for some of them who are new at that, going to a board might be a little bit intimidating. And so you want to set them at ease and indicate that it'll be a participative conversation and that it's not, you're not there to grill them. So there's a little bit of that, but at some point, if the other three people have thanked, you can say, ditto, and not have to spend a lot of time on that part.
And to your other comment about sort of the reluctance to own up to negative stuff going on, do you attribute that to a mindset of the people that are in positions of leadership, or to a culture within the organization, or where is that coming from, and how does one person change that?
So I think in my experience, and having been in and around the district office for the last few years in my volunteer roles, one of the things I noticed with Dr. Skelly in particular was that he didn't have a great filter for the things that were going to be important to other people sometimes. Like I used to say, he didn't have risk goggles. Like when we were talking about the calendar a few years ago, he'd come from a district where that was not a big issue. And so he just assumed it wouldn't be a big issue for us. And so when it became kind of a big thing, he was surprised by that. So that kind of a perspective is sometimes great, because then you just sort of forge ahead and you're eternally optimistic, and there's some value in that. But he's sort of lacked knowing when those things were going to blow up. And so I think we have an opportunity with someone who's much more seasoned and has been in all different levels of these kinds of roles, including a state level, where he has more of those risk goggles, like, okay, these are the kinds of things I've seen blow up other places, or be things that obviously we would share those things. So I think that's the case. From a one person on the board, I think the only opportunity you get is that you just say over and over again, tell me what you're working on, tell me what our risks are, tell me what risks are a few months down the line, tell me what's coming up, or we've had this sort of a finding or whatever, tell me exactly what's happening on those. So I think the combination of having a new superintendent and 2 new board members, I think, will be helpful.
You were just mentioning the calendar change, and there's certainly been a lot of issues that have, taken on some controversy.
A life of their own.
Life of their own, that's good. Mandarin immersion, everyday math.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you see any hard feelings lingering over issues like that, and if so, what can the board do, or what should the board have done to sort of ease tensions and facilitate greater communication on these issues?
It does seem like there is some level of mistrust and lingering mistrust. And so I think it's incumbent on us to rebuild that trust. And if I think back of the decisions that we made that kind of fell into that category, one of the things that struck me was not taking a systemic look at how to incorporate feedback from the community into the process. So if I think of, let's say, the budget discussions back around 2008, 2009, when we needed to cut millions of dollars out of the budget, I recall at that time Dr. Skelly came to me, and I was PTA council president, I think, and he said, what does the PTA think about this? So in his attempt to get some input, he was asking me, like, what does the PTA think about this? And I had to say, there's 9,000 people in the PTA. I can't represent 9,000 people. I mean, there are some people who have smaller organizations that are dozens of people or scores of people, and they can do that. And I said, you need to give me 2 weeks. I have to go out, survey PTA members, and give them a chance to say. I can't just say, oh, they don't want to cut this, they don't want to cut that, because you're really not getting a sample, a statistically significant sample. So we did, and we went out and surveyed people. We showed them the cuts that were potentially going to happen. We said, we want you to rank these. We want you to do like sort of a conjoint, this versus this, this versus this. We got like 1,400 responses. And so I could go back and say, okay, now that I have 1,400 responses, this is what, and you won't be surprised to know, parents didn't want cuts in the classroom. They wanted, superintendent, associate superintendents to go. No, they don't want janitor cuts either. No janitors. Don't cut the janitors, and don't cut days out, but make the classes a little bigger. But we could come back with data and say that. I think a lot of the decisions that ended up being really controversial were decisions that had very strong vocal input from small contingents of people, which is good because people were interested and hot under the collar about it, but bad because the people who didn't respond were a little disenfranchised and mistrustful of the process. Like, I have to go at 1 o'clock in the morning and wear my t-shirt and say these things? Why can't you just ask me? Like, why isn't there a way that I can just have input into the process? So I think that goes a long way. Like, I will tell you that while I won that fight with Dr. Skelly on the budget and saying, give me time to go figure out what they want, I didn't win that fight on the calendar. And I asked for more time because he did the same thing. He said, well, we have this email address that's calendar@pausd.org, and that's how we get input. And I was like, yeah. I had just come off running an HR research group at a big corporation where we did all kinds of statistical analysis on the employee base, and like we could, pretty quickly get input. And you're using an email address that few people know about, and they just get 20 of their friends to write the same email. So I didn't always win those battles. Occasionally I did.
Like you got a feeling to some extent that when you were asked for your views as PTA head, it was really to check off PTA says this is okay,
or that somehow I could divine what 9,000 people think, which I like to think I'm. So
a similar process didn't, as I recall, get used with how we were going to spend additional money once the availability, when funds started to loosen up. Dr. Skelly's recommendations for how those were going to be spent sort of came suddenly before the board, and that was it. It was about all of 2 weeks, I think, that was under consideration.
Yes. Is that succinct enough for you?
Okay.
So yes, I would have preferred a similar process, which actually included not only parental input, but a little blue sky. So there are opportunities to think big when you've cut some of the stuff that was cut out originally really was low-hanging fruit. I mean, like the short bus going around and delivering the materials to the board members, that kind of stuff, really should have been cut. But when it comes time to add stuff back, of course you're not going to add the same stuff back. Like, I'm a finance guy by training. I've mentioned that 3,000 times, I'm sure. But that gives you the opportunity to go out and do a little blue sky. Like, what would make this better? And let's not just like layer things back on piece by piece. Let's decide if there's a big investment we want to make and something we want to start, we have some reserves, we could use that kind of a startup capital and get that thing going. So I know as PI president I was pretty frustrated we didn't do that, because our donors have over the years said, what's that thing? Like, what is it?
So during the course of this campaign so far, you've been fairly vocal about some of the kinds of things we've just been talking about, of objections and concerns that you feel about the way the district has handled various things. As far as I can recall, however, you have not come before the board at all during the last 2 years and actually addressed the board on any of these issues. And your explanation at the first debate, I believe, was that as PI president, you felt that your role was to represent the narrow interests of your donors and make sure that donors were getting the information they needed, and that was a more focused role than a PTA council president. But I wonder if you could address the fact that you're being quite vocal during this campaign about some of these concerns, but it's sort of the first that the public has heard about it.
Well, I no longer represent thousands of people, right? So I just am speaking as myself now. And as I said earlier, it's a similar phenomena in PI as it is in PTA Council. If you have thousands of people in the organization, when you go and stand up and even when you say, I'm just speaking as myself, you have PTA members who may not agree with what you're going to say. Like, I remember on the calendar, I certainly had a personal opinion about what I thought the calendar should be, and I expressed that in email to calendar@pausd.org, and I expressed that to the staff members. But I couldn't take I didn't feel like I could take a public position as PTA Council President, even when you can say, I'm saying this personally. So in the years that I've been in those sorts of roles, in those leadership roles, my advocacy on particular topics has mostly been, one-on-one in those meetings that you can have with anybody who's at the district office. And in many of the things that I've advocated for, I didn't end up winning, right? I just have my opinion like any other community member, and sometimes things didn't go my way. So only in places where I felt like I could speak on behalf of the people who were in the organization did I do that. So like the budget is one example. Or the developmental asset survey, which is the survey we used as the baseline for developmental assets across the district. In that case, I could go, the district was reluctant to do it because we do survey the kids a lot, and so they were concerned about over-surveying because the questions were sort of similar to some of the other surveys they do. And in that case, going and standing in front of the board, even if I was doing it from a developmental asset standpoint, didn't seem appropriate. So I went in and said, this is what we'd like to see done. We Project Safety Net folks who work in developmental assets. I realize that you don't want to do it, and you have good reasons for that, but I'm bringing to the table volunteers who can go out and it's an opt-in thing, so you have to get every parent to sign something that says the kids will do it. I'm bringing resources who will get that opt-in done. I can get resources to go out and present the results when they come. So my style is not to stand in front of the board and say, I want you to do this because I want you to do this, and because I have thousands of people behind me. My style is much more, I understand why this is difficult for you. Let me bring you the resources to get it done. And so when we finally came to an agreement, we went out and got 4,000 kids done. And we used volunteers to take those pieces of paper into every classroom and get parents to sign them. And then when the data was back, we went out and presented it all over the place. And so we could hold up our end of the bargain. It was just, a set of parents who said we would do this. We didn't get everything. They didn't survey fourth graders. They surveyed 5, 7, 9, 10, 11, 12. And we'd asked for those plus fourth grade. So I didn't get everything. So my brand of advocacy is different. When I can be mistaken for the head of a big organization than when I'm just me. Right now, I don't represent anybody but me.
I'd like to talk about Project Safety Net for a bit. So you were one of the founders and you're a leader in that organization. I know that it's experienced some growing pains since the founding, that there's a reorganization last year. I want to know if you feel satisfied with the progress that group has made so far, and what kinds of sort of measurable results can you point to?
Okay, so one of the interesting things about Project Safety Net is that it's collaborative versus being an organization, right? So the beauty of a collaborative is that you learn from each other and that you can decide on some shared goals and try and make progress against those shared goals. So in my professional life, I work in a collaborative, which is an immigration collaborative, which is about 36 organizations working towards naturalizing legal permanent residence. So it's a great example for me because it works similarly. One of the differences is that it's had a very consistent leadership, which has been very helpful because you have a consistent set of folks who are helping all the different organizations make progress. Project Safety Net has not had that. To be honest, part of the reason, in my opinion, is because we ask a project safety net director to work for very low pay and no benefits on a contract that only runs for year to year, and I think it's hard to attract people. I mean, really, we're asking you to go into a community of very engaged people and to work your buns off, but we're not going to pay you, and we're not going to give you any benefits, and we're not going to give you any kind of security around that. So that central point that we've relied on has changed and has sat open for a while. So the individual organizations in Project Safety Net, I think, have taken their goals and worked on those goals, like the Herd Alliance. Are you familiar with that one? That's the health. It's the health providers. They've done a lot around like doing their toolkit and having more collaborations between themselves. And then like the partner to that is within the school district. The school district has those 369 referral available to kids, and then more counseling services at the elementary schools. And so there is, like, in that space, there's things happening. I don't think they've made as much progress as they wanted on more beds, because I hope that this has not happened to any of you, but one of my neighbor kids needed a bed in a mental health unit a couple years ago, and she and her mother and I worked on that, and it took a long time to find her a bed, and it was, in Redwood City. It wasn't here. So there's great progress on some of that stuff. Some of it that seems obvious, not so much. On the developmental asset side, the city and the school district both adopted that framework and have both made progress in that framework. So like they train the coaches and the summer, what do you call those, counselor guys, so that they've all got the same language, and the schools are working through the developmental assets. And then there's kind of this middle ground where it's not run by the city and it's not run by the school district, and that's where our team, our Project Safety Net team, sort of works. We do our caring neighbors stuff, and we do neighborhoods, value youth, things like that. So there's 22 strategies. I don't think you want me to go through the 22 of them, but in my mind, there's progress. Social change takes time, and our reliance on one person who we don't pay very well and we don't guarantee a job is probably ill-advised.
Social change also requires advocacy, and Project Safety Net has carefully, and I assume intentionally, chosen not to advocate. What's your view on that? Why do we not have Project Safety Net as a coalition agreeing to take some sort of advocacy position on issues that directly affect its mission when they're before the school board, for example, or the city council?
So that has never, in my mind, been anything we necessarily voted on our leadership team. And I think the relationship between having those entities at the table has not been the best setup, right? So you can't really advocate at the school board when the school is in theory at the table. So that relationship, I think a lot of great things have come out of that relationship, and a lot of work has happened, but it does make it sort of an awkward, like they're on the team, but we're going to advocate against them. So most organizations have sort of taken their own stand and not come together as Project Safety Net, because it's not an organization, it's just a coalition of people. It's not the best way to advocate. It has not worked very well.
You were on the Foreign Language and Elementary Schools Committee a few years ago, and
Yeah.
I know you did work on that. I'm wondering if you could talk about sort of the obstacles in getting it done then, and with so much, all the candidates, are all obviously for it now. What it looks like now and how it could get done now.
Okay. So the committee that I was on was in 2007 and 2008. And it was definitely not the first time it was done. So I think there had been one like maybe 10 years before. I remember Amado Padilla came and sat with us through some of our meetings and had said, well, we just did the same thing 10 years ago. And I was thinking, yeah, great. So what we ended up recommending was grades 3 through 5, and I'm not going to repeat the research that suggests why it's a good idea, because I think you guys probably know that. But what we recommended was grades 3 to 5, because we could figure out a way that the teachers could fit it in, and it could fit within the school day, and we thought that we could get the teachers to agree to that, and it was about like $1 million or so, $1.1 million. And so to us, it made perfect sense, right? Because we did all this research, we had the benefit of really chewing on this and knowing that it was cognitively great for our kids, and we were very confident. But it was 2008, so we went to the board, and you may recall there was sort of a financial downturn then. We went to the board, and they just said no. And part of the frustration is when you listen to the immersion programs, they're cost neutral, and so when you come and you suggest something that costs money, it gets a little bit shunted off to the side because we're always concerned about money. So for me, it seemed like an obvious thing when things were turning around. Okay, maybe we should consider how to do this, even though it's $1 million a year, which is a lot of money, and it would be a little more now because we have given teachers a little bit of a raise since then. It seems like an obvious fit. We've been back at this thing many times. So did I answer that question? I kind of feel like there was some other part of it I haven't answered yet.
So you're saying it's basically it was a money thing, and you think that now the district is in a better position to
I think
get
so.
it done.
I mean, the research isn't any different, right? It's still good for kids, and it has to be weighed against the other things that we could potentially do. If we go and do a little blue sky work, and we say FLES isn't it, there's some other thing that we should do instead. I'm having trouble thinking of what that thing is, but this isn't what I do for a living. I just happen to know that FLES over the years has come back many times. And even from the donor perspective, when I was in my PI role, it was one of the things that we would get as input from our PI donors. Because of course we survey them to figure out what the district needs and what they want to fund, where the overlap is. And that was one that came up as a donor request, but that the district wasn't ready to do, and so we would say.
Well, probably the most obvious competition of a good chunk of money would be the opening of a 13th elementary school.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it would. The capital fund, of course, there's funding for that, but running it is there. You're right.
So how would you trade off those two, if you had to?
If I had to trade off those two?
Yeah.
I probably would.
Important to you?
I think FLES is more important to me.
Would you be supportive of the bridging of the gap with the Mandarin classes for the middle schools at this point, which some of the parents have advocated for? That's a very specific set of kids.
Yeah, but they're kids who already exist. So given that the kids are already there, I feel like if we're going to be a student-centered place, we got to think of what it means for the students. It wasn't clear to me what kind of a evaluation process there would be for deciding if that was what we wanted to do after it was done. I mean, we would say this is kind of what we expect the outcome to be for those kids, and then go back and measure that and do that sort of thing that we used to do in my professional life a lot. But given that there are kids already there, it feels like they need something for them.
So just to continue on the budget and fiscal areas, because that is something that you are promoting as important skill that you bring to the board. I wonder how you would characterize the current condition of the district's finances.
Okay, well, there's always something floating around, right? There's always some threat to our finances. So the current CBO does a very conservative budgeting process. She uses 2% property tax growth as her base because 2% is what the county's allowed to charge you even if you don't move, right? So that assumes nobody ever moves ever, and that property values don't go down. So that's how you get to 2%. It would be 2%. What has happened to us in the past is occasionally it's less than 2%, not very often, but we have over the last 10 years.
Was it less than 2%?
I would say back in the early 2000s. I looked at this just recently. There was a couple of times it was under 1%, but not very often, right? More often it's like 5, 6, 7%, something like that. So there's that sort of variable. The other variable is we always seem to have something that the state wants to take back, right? So for us right now, it's the it's sharing the liability for pensions and the growth in our pension costs, which will be between now and 2012. I think it gets up to like $12 million extra each year. It sort of grows to that number. So that's real. That's a real dollar amount. The other one for us is the reserve cap, which is potentially floating around. That one feels like it may resolve itself and be less of an issue. But really, so for us, the big part is the 2% property tax growth, right? So property tax is like 75% of our budget, or it's 75% of our budget. And then you can layer parcel tax on top of that. So for me, historically, the kinds of budgeting that I've done in the past says you do a couple of scenarios, and so that once you know that you're out of the most conservative scenario, you know where the money goes next. Or you could say, this is my 2% scenario, this is my 5% scenario, this is my 0% scenario if for some reason that were going to happen, so that you know what you're going to cut and what you're going to add. So we had this method called zero-based budgeting, where I spent a lot of time working, and that really focused on kind of in that scenario band. So you knew what were the most important things, what were the things that were right at the edge, and what would you add next if you got more money. So it feels like the current budgeting process for us doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about this, so we end up putting it in reserves. So that doesn't serve us well, because you don't want to have money you're not spending. Of course, as a basic aid district, we want to protect ourselves with a reserve, but once you're over that, you're not doing programs, right? You're not doing stuff that you should be doing.
So you would support a more, for lack of a better word, liberal policy in terms of budgeting, so that we're not, in essence, lowballing every year and moving money into reserves when we end the year with a surplus.
Well, finance guys will almost never say a more liberal budgeting policy.
I know.
Generally, what we say is that a more flexible budgeting policy, so that you know where the next dollars are going to go and you're prepared to spend them when the time comes, right? Because you don't want to be in a situation where you're like, okay, I'll have this extra money and now it's going to take us 6 months to decide what to do with it.
But you also can't go from having a reactive budget that simply year to year mirrors the property tax revenue increase or level, because then you're going to be cutting programs in a year when that's lower numbers. So,
well, she does do five-year forecasts, right?
Right, at 2%. Well, so it creates a completely unrealistic, I think everybody agrees that's a completely unrealistic view of the outlying years. So what's the point of that, other than to show what would happen if this incredibly low rate of property tax increase should occur year after year for 3 or 4 years?
I think we might be saying the same thing.
Yeah, no.
Oh, okay. Okay, yeah. Yes, I agree with you.
You just don't like the word liberal, which is fine. That's fine.
Finance guys just can't. We just don't say that about budgeting,
right,
because you don't want to be throwing money around.
Right.
But there are ways to consider how to spend money, and you have to have thought about it beforehand, before the time comes.
So one way we're spending a lot of money right now is unfortunately on legal fees. This year we're on track to spend between $400,000 and $500,000 on legal fees, much of which is driven by disputes with special ed families, where we are, as a district, arguing with those families over whether the services that the families think are needed for their kids is really a district responsibility. How do we fix that situation, or is there a solution in your mind to the skyrocketing legal costs and the confrontation that's occurring with special ed families?
Okay, those are two really different questions.
Mm-hmm.
So from a finance perspective, sometimes you have expenses that you weren't expecting, right? And sometimes you can say, we're not going to spend any more. So in these kinds of cases, frequently legal costs end up being in the category of like, you have to spend them because you've engaged lawyers and you've gotten yourself in a pickle. So really the more important side is, how do you keep yourself out of that pickle, which is making you spend hundreds of thousands of dollars you didn't intend to spend. So for me, that expectation sort of goes farther back to understanding up front where we've not been clear or fair or had that kind of a relationship with the people that we're working with. Like, it seems like the mistrust is so high that if you have a situation with the district, you go in expecting it not to go well. So for me, I have, did I mention I live in a great neighborhood? I have another one of my neighbors who's a special ed kid who has a very unique set of stuff, and frequently her parents start their conversations with the district in a place of dread. Like, how is this going to go? It's just not going to go it's not going to go well. Like, I've gone with them to just be an extra set of ears, just because they say, we want somebody else just to be able to hear it all so that when we come back to process it, we have somebody to process it with. And that's just unacceptable, right? You already have enough raising a kid who's got special issues that really you don't need this school district making it worse, right? So I think we have a long way to go to rebuild that. I think we have families who would be willing to be more trustful if they felt like they were getting a fair shake. I mean, the I in IEP is individual, right? So each one of them has to be done individually, and you don't want people to feel like, oh, this kid got this thing, but I think my kid might need the same thing. Like, what is even available? Like, what are the options versus let me try and figure out what some other kid has so I can ask for the same thing? That doesn't feel right to me. It feels like if these are the sorts of issues you have, these are the sorts of things that we can do to help that. My kids are special ed kids themselves, both of them, and luckily for us, their issues are things that are pretty common, so it's much more clear the kinds of accommodations that have helped other kids, and so the anxiety is much less. I mean, you still have a little bit of anxiety when a teacher doesn't acknowledge or support that, and I've had very little issues with that, but a little bit. It's much easier when they're middle of the road, and these are the sorts of things that have helped other kids, and you know that.
I want to ask about site-based decision-making. So I believe you were the one at the last Thursday's debate, two debates ago, who said that when it comes to district kind of authority, definitely issues of safety and health should be uniform across the district. And I'm just wondering where you draw the lines on the autonomy versus the district's authority when it comes to programs like social emotional learning and anti-bullying programs. Do you think those are things that could be individualized to the schools but somehow comparable? Or do you think that's a type of program that really needs to be sort of more top-down?
So one thing that I've learned in my life and my career is that sometimes you have, the outcome is what you want, right? So if we think about social emotional and social kindness kinds of things, the outcome that we want is that we want kids to understand that, we want them to feel safe at school, we want them to be upstanders and not bystanders. And so as a starting point, you'd like to get to that outcome. Another outcome which you would want, and I would want, is that the kids come, when they do end up in the same place, like a middle school or a high school, that they have common language, because that promotes that outcome, right? So even just like that upstander, bystander language, the kids who have that know it. Now, traditionally, these things have grown organically, and frequently it's because a PTA decided they were going to do it, or like one particular teacher on campus decided they were going to do it. I would like to move towards having them have the same language as part of the outcome, which probably means the programs would be the same, but that's less important to me than the outcomes are the same. So that part is not something that you would probably wholesale go out and take it away from all 12 schools and give them something different. But it seems like you can evolve there. So in all of the sort of site-based versus centralized decision-making touch points, I think it's important to remember that the outcome is what you're after, and sometimes the process should be the same, particularly if you're starting from scratch. I mean, you might as well just figure out what the best way is and do it. It's harder when you're not starting from scratch. So for me, outcome is the thing, and I would like, particularly around language and having that same core set of stuff they learned along the way. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, it does.
Redefining this model seems to be one of the new superintendent's priorities.
Yeah, me too.
From what I gather, and you agree with that?
Yeah, it is. I think it's much easier to operate when you understand what the parameters are. So I'm sure I must have said this someplace, because you use a little bit of the language I think I must have used wherever it was, but there are like thousands of decisions that happen every day, right, in the district, and you want those decisions when they affect kids to be made near kids. But there's definitely, we're a learning environment, and we want to learn from each other. And there are some decisions, like in a factory decision, right? Like when you're building a new factory, you might as well build it just like the other factory, because they're still going to make microprocessors, and you want people to be safe. And if it works well here, you might as well use it there. So I think we need a model I can't say what that model is exactly, like at which decisions should be only outcome based, and you have some leeway. I mean, you can talk about it on the extremes, right? The carpeting is gray here, but the carpeting could be blue.
Are there specific programs within either the diversity of programs that exist or with a pilot program that's being tried now? Any particular priorities that you see for looking at for effectiveness immediately, and then deciding either we should have fewer of those programs or we should replicate this program to more schools?
Do you mean things that happen at the individual schools?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean? Mm-hmm. Let's see. Nothing comes to mind at the moment, except that at the high schools, they're quite different, right? And they each have their own strengths. And so there are sometimes the things that are a strength at one high school and not the other, you probably don't want to try and replicate, because those personnel can't be lifted from one place to the other. But for example, at Palo now they're doing a writing center. So the kids, like writing, I don't know what you guys think, but writing doesn't seem like it's the greatest in our district. And so they're putting in a writing center. So you can go any time of day. The kids can go whenever their prep period is or after school and get writing help. And that seems like one of those things that we could probably look at in a few months or at the beginning of next year and say, like, how did that work? Did kids use it? Do we see any difference in their outcomes? That sort of thing, and say, okay, do it or not do it, or continue it or not continue it. So if we're going to continue it, then we should proliferate it. And if we're not going to continue it, we should have data that says, you know what, it turns out that lots of kids came in, but they didn't actually do anything different, or no kids came in at all, whatever that might be.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe during the entire period of the OCR investigations and the family complaints that led to those investigations and the district's actions, you were silent about those issues. And then in June, when the resolution criticizing OCR was in front of the board, you told our reporter that you really didn't have enough information to have an opinion on it, mm-hmm. and therefore at that time didn't advocate one way or the other on the adoption mm-hmm. of that resolution. As you know, since the campaign started, your position has evolved, and you've stated that, well, I'm not going to put words in your mouth,
okay.
so I'll let you describe
okay.
how you've gotten to your current position and why you opted to not voice any opinions up until
okay.
recently.
So, in much like other things, haven't publicly taken a position on things. I left my role at PI at the end of May, like May 25th or something like that, like right before the delegation went to see Dr. McGee's hometown, like literally like a few days before. So up until that point, you probably wouldn't have heard anything from me publicly. My private conversations were more around, I don't understand how this quagmire got to be a quagmire, and why are we, like, do you realize what this looks like? Those kinds of conversations, but that's neither here nor there since no one's in the room with me when those conversations happened. I can't remember who asked me the question. Maybe it was Chris asked me the question, well, what do you think? And for me, I wanted to see the conversation and figure out what it was that wasn't visible and that it didn't seem obvious. Like it didn't pass the smell test. Like, why would we do this? So
This meaning
why would we?
adopting the resolution.
Yes, why would we adopt this resolution? So for me, knowing the 5 different board members and knowing that they're reasonable people, okay, so there's something happening that's not visible, and there's something, conversations happen behind closed doors, and I've certainly been in plenty of conversations myself behind closed doors on legal or personnel matters where you think the speculation that's going on outside the door is not helpful, so I'm not going to play in that sandbox and speculate. So I think what you just said was that it seemed different after the campaign started. I think actually
Well, I
the
think I
turning,
just said that your position has evolved, and
that was after you said it changed after the campaign started. So I appreciate the friendly amendment, because the turning point really was watching the hours worth of conversation about it, right? So they took it to the board and they spent about an hour discussing it, and they had the lawyer in the room kind of talking about the OCR was asking for input, and maybe some kind of remark like they said, so sue us, or something like that, that was kind of a sort of a flip remark at the time. But for me, listening to the process by which the conversation got to the resolution voting wasn't very compelling. And I think I might have said it earlier as we went through these questions. You sort of have this feeling that when the heels are dug in and there's not a way to back out, that they've gotten themselves to this position where they're doing something that's maybe not productive. And spending an hour trying to explain why that is probably a pretty good indication that it's not productive, right? I mean, I hate to simplify it so much, but if in an hour you can't explain it, then it's probably not the best route. So I would like to think, having sat there in the 2 years before that came, that we wouldn't have gotten to that point, because I'd like to think of being a continuously learning operation whose open kimono about things helps you not get to that point. So for me, watching the hours worth of conversation where I sat in the back and thought, okay, I can see that point, I can see that point, I can see that point, but they're just not hanging together in a way that I think is worthwhile.
I want to touch a little bit upon culture and parent engagement. There was a question from a student who was concerned that they couldn't give any feedback about a teacher for fear of being identified, there being retribution. And I understand that that's not unusual in a school district, but I'm just wondering, from a board perspective, is there anything that you see could be done or needs to be done to change the culture so that there's more communication between parents, students, and teachers, so that there's much more of a sense of collaboration instead of concern that this is going to affect my future or my grade?
So do you mean in the evaluative process, or do you mean just in general?
I think in general.
Okay.
I mean, there's 2 parts to it, because then there's also teachers who feel harassed maybe by parent involvement, overbearing parents.
Well, it would be nice if our teacher evaluation process, so like evaluating teachers is something that we're going to talk about probably for a long time, right? Trying to figure out how to evaluate teachers is a tough one. But they do get evaluations written, I think it's every other year. And in my HR experience, an evaluation is actually a really important tool, right? It's not a punitive tool, it's a development tool. And if you reframe the conversation around development and have a professional evaluation system, I think it really benefits everybody involved. And so let me back up to say that evaluation systems that give useful feedback give lots of different perspectives on the feedback. So of course teachers don't want just the parents who are unhappy with them to give feedback, right? That's not helpful, because that's just sort of one-sided feedback. So a system by which we have evaluations that have 360-degree feedback from teachers and parents and administrators and their peers gives you a more well-rounded look. One of the things I did in my professional life was, when I worked in an HR organization, is that we actually audited the evaluations. And so people would write all the evaluations, and they have to be done by X date, and they all get turned in, and they get delivered to the employees, and they get their development areas. We would go out and take samples to make sure people were writing evaluations that were actually leaning towards development and giving the employees development options and then tools and resources to actually be developed. So it's a learning for the people who write the evaluations, right? Like if I'm pulling an evaluation you wrote and it's it's too maybe too simple, or it doesn't have a lot of development stuff in it, I can coach you on how to do that better. So I think we would benefit from that. The other thing is when you pull a bunch and you do samples, you can sometimes see like a common theme of a development need. And you're like, oh, I just pulled all these samples. And it turns out that the finance analysts need communication skills training. And then you can go after that because you have enough of a sample size that you can like, oh, this is something we should go train on. So it helps your overall professional development because you can see sometimes where the gaps are by looking at the evaluations. So I think there are plenty of ways to do that where it's not punitive for the people for whom you're asking for input.
We only have a couple minutes left, so I'd like to try to tick off a few questions and get pretty short answers as possible. And to follow up on kind of building on your HR experience, you must have had some strong views and reactions to the Phil Winston matter that came before the board. It's an unusual situation in that the law permitted all of the investigative records to be made public, which they were. So we all have the same look at the same information. What would you have done if you were on the board in his case? And do you feel it's appropriate and okay for him to be teaching in the classroom right now?
Well, it doesn't feel very student-centered. So if we want to be a place where we think about our students first, it doesn't feel student-centered to me. And it feels like I didn't have any kind of, my kids go to Pali, and I never had any kind of interaction with him that suggested that was happening. And my kids didn't either, so it was quite a surprise to me. And I felt like maybe I was the last person to know somehow, like I'm not sure how that happened. But that's not something I'd like in the classroom with kids, no.
Would you have voted to terminate him?
Yes.
Okay. On the English laning and delaning debate, I don't want to get into it deeply because you've already explained sort of your concerns about the process and your empathy for the teachers and putting that proposal together. What I haven't heard, however, from you is what you actually think about the proposal. So would you support delaning as was proposed by the teachers if it came to the board in a perhaps better way, or are you opposed to that direction?
I personally think the kids benefit from lanes, and that there are different topics in which they want lanes, and we've delaned things over the years, right? And we've delaned history some number of years ago. I think there is still a place for a 9A kind of class for kids who really dig that stuff. Now, if that means that we're not treating all kids equally and they're not getting the support they need and the classes end up not being, like there's a horizontal consistency problem and a consistency problem in class, that's a different kind of thing. But I do think that there are some kids who like English more than other kids and want to spend more time in that topic.
You raised the issue of horizontal consistency, and the students have raised this as a concern of theirs and a stress-inducing situation where teachers of different teachers teaching the exact same courses are imposing different requirements on the kids, different grading standards, different homework, different tests, some more rigorous than the others. Is your view of that's life, just like getting a good teacher and a bad teacher is going to happen in the course of going through school, and deal with it? Or is there an actual problem that needs to be and should be addressed?
I think it's the latter. So I think for us, we have instructional supervisors. We have teachers who have varying levels of experience teaching. And we have principals. And so the combination of those three kinds of flavors of people should be able to get a consistent access to the education for those kids. So if you have a chemistry class, and I just went to a coffee this morning where this was the case, and the kids are watching Mythbusters and learning the periodic table they learned in 7th grade, that does not feel right when the other kids are learning, like one of my kids has chemistry now as well, and he's got a really great teacher who's doing these formative assessments and they benchmark tests, and they don't move on until all the kids have learned the material that was in the quiz, and it's just a really different environment. And If those two kids didn't know each other, that might be fine, and it wouldn't be stress-inducing, but it certainly isn't fair, and it's not the kind of access to a good education that we want for our kids. And it does induce some stress. Amazingly, from, in this case, the kid is watching Mythbusters, who wants to learn more about chemistry, and sometimes from the kid who's got the harder class, who feels like it's just a fairness issue, and while maybe we're mature enough not to have that reaction, that's a lot to ask from teenagers, I think.
And then on Coverly, finally, I know it's unfair to ask you to answer this quickly, but are you prepared to give up on the covenant not to develop battle that's taking place, where both the city and the school district have dug in and drawn hard lines on that particular issue?
Well, I a little bit feel like sometimes when a negotiation gets to a position where you're shaking your head and thinking, like, how did we get to this position? It's sort of nice when one of the senior negotiators in the operation moves on. And I think that kind of gives you a window of opportunity to reset. And for me, I'm very hopeful that at some point when, heels are dug in and there's a little bit of give and you have somebody who's more experienced in that sort of thing, that we will see some progress there. So that's my...
Did you have any last questions? So let me just end with this one, since we've asked this to a couple of the other candidates. Regardless who wins in this election, or I should say, I guess, with the results of this election, do you think the voters will be sending a message of some kind to the district about the school district that it wants to have? Will there be a message in the outcome of this election?
Well, you may have heard in our debates, we don't actually sound that different. Right? So I'm not sure what message you necessarily get out of that. So I would think that the message is that our community cares about the schools, and so they'll come and vote on these things, and they come to the debates and they listen to us. I think all four of us, all five of us even, count Jay in there, have this very similar, we care about the kids, we want to make sure we have great teaching, we want to make sure we have innovation. So I don't see much of a message. What are you after? You're smart.
Well, I'm not after.
Okay.
That's a perfectly fine answer.
Because if you listen to us, particularly if you haven't worked with us necessarily, we look very similar. I think if you've worked with the four of us, the way we work is probably a little bit different, and the amount of involvement we've had in the district is pretty darn different. But if you're not aware of that, and you may not be, because it certainly didn't come up in the debates.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks.